Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Before we get started here, could someone please type in the chat box if they can hear me okay? All right, fantastic. I'm getting yeses. Okay, perfect. And now you guys know where the chat box is. Very good. Well, on behalf of the ILGISA Education Committee, I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. We're happy to announce that we have nearly 100 registered for this series from all over the state of Illinois and beyond. We are looking forward to your comments and questions during the program. When you have a comment or question for our speaker, please enter it into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and our speaker will do his best to answer your questions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Bert McAlpine is a GIS coordinator for Julie Inc. with over 19 years of GIS experience. He is a GISP and an Esri certified ArcGIS desktop professional. He works with different entities around the state using GIS data to help in Julie's processes. Mr. McAlpine uses Python every day in managing base data for all 102 counties, Julie's 2,000 plus member data, and various SQL reporting and analysis. Mr. McAlpine has a BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Biology, a BS in Biology with Environmental Option, and a BS in Chemistry with Environmental Option from Arkansas Tech University. Today, Mr. McAlpine will be presenting a webinar entitled Python, I've Never Heard of It, which is the first of a series of 4 webinars centered around Python. Please give your warmest virtual welcome to Bert McAlpine. And Bert, this is my reminder for you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Great.
So I guess, hello everyone. I know you can't respond very well. So I hear somebody that says they hear nothing. So I might try dialing in, or you can use your computer audio. You got 2 different options with Ring. Hopefully you can get that sorted out. It is going to be recorded, so if you need to, you can listen to it later. So this webinar in the series is just trying to get folks who don't have any programming experience. Hello? Oh, don't have any programming experience to understand what Python is a little bit and to be able to use it. And a lot of folks, they hear program, they just get scared. So Python is your friend, and it doesn't have to be used for just GIS. I use Python for all different kinds of things. My email's there in the front. Feel free to give me an email. I will also make sure to send out the slide deck and then the code later today. So everybody's got that for you, so don't worry about writing stuff down. So just a little bit about Python. It was started by a guy who actually works for Google now, Guido van Rossum. And it's different than most of the other programming languages because you can actually read it and see what it says. A lot of the programming is like C+ and some of the other ones, normal folks, even when I look at them, like, I don't know what that means, and all the brackets and curly cues and everything else. It's just confusing for a lot of folks. So that's why this Python is at this point, the world's fastest growing programming language, and has been for several years now. There's lots of applications written in pure Python. If you're into graphic manipulation, you can look at GIMP. That's completely written in Python. There's a bunch of web pages, all that are written in pure Python. So it's human readable. So it looks like English. It supports multiple programming styles, and we're not going to get into that too much, but there's 3 main styles. Procedural, so you basically write a script and tell it, I want you to run this, and then run this, and then run this. So you just do things serially, and there's no other stuff needed. But it also supports functional. So you make functions. We'll go over that at the next webinar. And it also supports object-oriented programming. So if you're coming from a different language that supports object-oriented programming or functional programming, you can pick which one of those is going to be best for your style. And if you're new to it, just start with procedural. Look at functional. I do basically 100% functional programming. One of the nice things about it is it runs on anything. You can get Python for your phone, whether it's Android or iOS. You can run a Mac, you can run a Windows. You can make EXEs out of it, so you don't even have to have Python installed on something. For the GIS side of stuff, there is one issue that ArcPy only works on Windows at this point. I think if you have server installed on Linux, it would work there too. So I mean, just don't think anything you write in ArcPy is going to work on those platforms, because it's not going to happen. And then Esri's been encouraging users to use it. They really started that when they announced VBA was going away, which it's still technically not gone away. And that's when I made the switch. I had a bunch of stuff written in VBA, and I just converted it all to Python. And then there's lots of batteries included. So Python by itself is kind of a framework, but it comes with a whole bunch of standard libraries, which are called modules, and we'll get into those a little bit later, that are shipped with it. So when you open up ArcMap, and everybody's got the same modules. You don't have to install anything. There's nothing else to do. You got a whole bunch of stuff just included. So if you're giving something to a coworker or a client, whatever the case may be, you don't have to worry about having them install a bunch of stuff to get your code to work. If you do need something very special that's not in the standard library, there are hundreds and hundreds of third-party modules you can download. And if you want to, you can make your own modules. If you have some stuff that you do all the time and you want to make that a module available to you, you can do that. One thing that's kind of nice about scripts is you can run them in the task scheduler, and you can also, if you have models, I think it's 2 lines of code, you can write a little Python script to execute your model whenever you want to, via just Windows Task Managers. And then don't forget, this is much more than GIS programming. You know, I can interact with Word documents. I can interact with Excel documents. You know, I can build algorithms. I can do some open source processing for GIS. So don't think it's, well, you know, this is just what Esri uses. It's because it really is a whole lot more stuff. I use this every night, a program I built to compact data I get every day and zip it and store it for me in archive format. If I didn't have that scheduled, I'd have to do it by hand every day, and I'm too lazy for that. There are some differences when we get to Esri and ArcPy. Python 2 is used in desktop. Python 3 is used in Pro. They're very similar, but there are some differences that can drive you a little bit insane if you're starting in it. So I recommend, if you just start in one platform or the other. And as we go over stuff, I'll try to point out anything that is specific to Pro or that is specific to desktop, as far as Python 2 or Python 3. But if you're using Esri, like I'm assuming most of us are, tell you what, if somebody's not using Esri for GIS, why don't you throw it in the chat what you're using, and I'll keep talking. So for Esri, you got, you know, field calculator, label expressions. You can manage all your AGO users, passwords, administration stuff. You can update layers. You can put up map packages. You can automate all that stuff. Same with Portal, basically. You know, you're on premise. You can do GP tools. You can do all your server side SDE maintenance. You know, post reconcile. You can schedule and do all kinds of stuff. And I know a lot of folks do a whole bunch of that with Esri software, and there is lots of examples to get started with. Now you'll be a little different, like if you're dealing with federated servers versus non-federated servers and services. There's a little bit of difference there, but it's not a huge deal. And if you're comfortable with Model Builder, you can use your scripts in models. You can also, when you're working with models, you can export your model out as a Python script if you want to see how it works in the Python world. I warn you now, when it does export it out of Model Builder, it is very, very ugly. And we'll look at that in the third way in the webinar as far as how it's going. So you can scripts can be added to the toolbox, and so you can make a GP script tool that looks like the little scroll thing when you're looking in your toolbox, or not. You can have them completely standalone. You can run your scripts in process or out of process, and that's just the way how you set them up. And we'll get into that when we get into ArcPy in session 3, because that's going to make a difference. And the main thing for Python is if you're doing anything over and over again, GIS or not, look for a solution in Python to save yourself some time and schedule some tasks. I met one gentleman a few years ago, and he had 600 data-driven pages and he had to update them once a month, and he was doing it by hand. And I told him there was a better way, and he does that now, and it's just automatically done for him. So that's a much nicer way for him to do stuff. So the ArcPy has its own, it's a site package, and a site package is a group of modules. Those are hyperlinks. Like I said, you'll get the slide. There's a data access module for looking at and viewing data as far as rows and records. There's a mapping module which deals with the map, table of contents, layers, that kind of stuff. There's also spatial analysts. Obviously, you have to have the extension for that, and there's network analysts. You have to have the extension for that. And like I said, we're going to get into some of that later. But let's go. So I don't know anything about Python, and I want to get started. The first thing is, do not use a text editor. Don't use Notepad++ because it makes it look like, you know, it color codes stuff. Don't do that to yourself. Get an IDE. There are several that are free. IDLE is included with Python. It is not an IDE, in my opinion. There are 3 that I can recommend. If you're just going to do Python and not do anything else, PyCharm Community Edition, which is free, which is free for the public and for the private sector, so it's free to everybody, is a really good one to do if you're just going to do Python. So PyCharm Community Edition. The next one, PyScripter, used to be really good, and it wasn't supported for a while. I think it's supported again now, so I don't really know. I haven't used it in a long time. Wing is another really good Python IDE, but it's not free. I don't know that it's better than PyCharm or not. I know some folks that swear by it. What I use, I've had some folks ask me before the webinar, is I use Microsoft Visual Studio Community Edition. So I do that before, well, I mean, so I use that one. I started with PyScript and went to this one. So I deal with more than just Python. So I use JavaScript and a few other things too, and I can do all of those in Visual Studio Community Edition. There's another one that I got some friends that use, and they really like it, and that's Microsoft Visual Studio Code. And I guess I failed to mention what IDE is. So IDE is an interactive development environment. That's going to make it where you can debug code, so you can run your code line by line and explore what's going on, and especially if it breaks, you can see exactly what's going on, interact with it to find out why it's breaking and how do I fix it, or how do you fix it, or how do you fix somebody else's stuff. And just don't do a text editor. And we'll get into some of the benefits of IDE, because I have very few slides, and we're going to jump right into an IDE to get started. There is a bunch of online resources. Stack Overflow is one of my friends. I go there quite often. Stack Overflow is a website. geared towards more towards programming, not necessarily just Python. And there are lots of questions that have been asked and answered, and they vote the most appropriate, quote unquote, answer up. So you got a pretty good idea what's going on. There's two different Python homepages. One's for Python 2, which is in maintenance mode, basically not having anything added to it, and maintenance and bug fixes. And then there's Python 3, which is the current active Python. And there's a whole bunch of tutorials there. You've also got the Esri help. So anything ArcPy related, if you search the help, you're going to get ArcPy examples that will basically work. You got to change like the data paths and stuff, but they pretty much work. And there is one free Python session that Esri offers, free for everybody. And then there are several if you have active maintenance, and I got the link in the description for that. And then there's also some Esri videos, and of course YouTube and Google if you want to go that route, which is fine. And and there are some free courses too. When I first started learning Python, I used Code Academy, which was completely free. And then, like I said, if you get stuck, Google it, Stack Overflow, and then you can always use the Esri community as a place, which used to be, I think it's GeoNet forums or whatever, what it used to be. But for some very specific odd stuff, that's a pretty good place to get some answers. The main thing is if you can have some coworkers or some folks that you know, you can bounce ideas off each other. That's a real good way to do it. We're gonna get done. Let's see. Somebody just asked why use Python. So so we covered that a little bit. But Python, you can automate your task. You can make stuff that the functionality is not available yet. Like I use Python sometimes. I only have an ArcView basic license, and I can do stuff that I'm not supposed to be able to do using open source software to like do a simplification and some other things that would be Esri standard or advanced licenses. It's not that I'm encouraging you to do that, but it's certainly possible. Also, you can do Python in lots of different programs. I know if you're familiar with QGIS, it's got a Python console in it. So it's, Python is a very versatile language. So let's just jump into kind of, hey, here's the tools you're gonna need to understand to make something that you can use. So this is my ID. And if you hold your cursor over stuff, it's going to give you a little bit of interaction. It's also going to allow you to do some IntelliSense. But first thing I'm going to do is this is all of my code in the top window, and I will provide all this, so don't worry about typing it out. So I'm going to import ArcPy. And so when I import ArcPy, that's going to allow me to call that site package and everything under that. I just do that because I'm going to use it later, so don't forget. One very important thing is to make comments. So anything with a hashtag is a comment. And I normally kind of have a rule of thumb, unless it's something really, really basic that I know I won't forget, is for every couple lines of codes, there's a line of comment. Because it's real easy to think, oh, I wrote that, and that's what it does. I'll never forget. And you come back 2 years later, and you're like, why am I doing it that way? And if you make yourself a comment like there was a bug and this was my workaround, then you know what's going on. And a lot of stuff I have in here is commented out because it can't evaluate, so it won't run. One thing the IDE does, just real quick, is if I type something, I get that's not right. So there's end of line scanning, and then also in this IAD, it says, hey, there's an error. So as you're typing it, it's going to populate errors as you're typing it. And change that back. So lots of folks when they're new to Python, as long as you have the same pair of quotes, whether they're single quotes or double quotes, Python doesn't care. And you can see when it interprets the double quote, it calls them single quotes. As long as you don't mix and match them, it's fine. And one equal sign is you're assigning a value to something, and two is you're testing it. So if I want to test that single quote is equal to double quote, I get true. And we're about to talk about variables, but the first thing before that is there are some keywords in Python that cannot be used for anything. And there's a module called import, or called keywords. And then what I'm calling here is I'm going to show us a list of keywords. And that way we can, so any of these words, it's not a real long list, but any of these words you cannot use because they're already accepted. So you can't set them to a variable. There's only one way to use them, and Python controls that. And if you'll, in my IDE, they're blue. So you have some idea that you can't use them. So there's variables, and in Python, a variable is an object. So now I've assigned the string test to v1. So if I want to see what type of object it is, now it's a string class. Also, in a good IDE, which most of them are, you can hover over them and it will tell you what kind it is. And some of them will infer. So if you have it listed somewhere else and you're doing some logic on it, it's going to consider, like, I haven't assigned this value yet, and it doesn't know what it is. So the first one's a string. And in Python, lots of stuff is strings, representative strings, pass, file pass, names, all different types of things. So string could be anything. I mean, and you could have, if you put quotes around number one, it would be a string. So the 1 digit with no decimal places is integer by default. You got to type int. And then if you do a 1.1, you get a float. So that just means it has a decimal place. Any math you do, if you multiply 1 times 100.0, it's going to change that out to a float rather than an integer. And then there are lists. We're going to get into lists in a little bit more details. And then there are tuples. Tuples and lists are very similar. They are a little different. So that's how you assign variables. You just say equals and then whatever it is to. One thing where you're dealing with a whole bunch of variables is sometimes, not always, you need to do some cleanup. So in this case, if you want to delete a variable, you can just do delete and then separate them by comma, and it's a very easy way to do cleanup. And now those variables, if I type in v1, it says I don't know what it is because it's not defined. Again, in a text editor, you have no idea because you wouldn't get any feedback. Esri does stuff a little bit different, or you can. So I'm going to assign the variable shp to a path to this shapefile, and then I'm going to run a GP tool. So I'm just going to check to see if it exists. And then after that, I'm going to, well, what type of result is that? Because the GP tools return the result. And so in this case, it is a Boolean, so true or false. And if I say E, it's true. And then another type is a, so that just ran. So I took the input shape, and then I said in memory, which is a temporary workspace. Pretty much that wherever you want to stick it, that's fine. And then 100 feet, and then I also said the type R. So the type R in this is a results object. If we just do R, I think it says result. Yeah, it says result. So rather than retyping the full path or anything else, I've just assigned this new buffer the value of R, and that's what I'm doing to it. Python is also case sensitive until you get into Esri. Somebody's drawing diamonds on my screen. Is case sensitive. So shape is not the same as SHP. Get all lowercase, you're going to get an error. So watch your case. The parameters inside all of the Esri tools are case insensitive, so they don't care. Yeah. So somebody asked what a GP tool is. So that's geoprocessing tools. That's basically everything in your toolbox. If you're familiar with Esri or QGIS or any other GIS software, is going to have some sort of toolbox. So geoprocessing covers a wide range of converting data, processing data, analysis, all kinds of things. We already kind of went over what float, integer, and string are. But now, if I take an integer and times a integer, I get a integer out. I get no decimal places. If I take an integer times a float, even though my integer is 1 and then my float is 1, so they're both whole numbers, I'll still get the float out. So that's going to be important if you're dealing with times and data, as far as, and even you know, some raster algebra, because you want to make sure you're not converting stuff to integer when it should be float and vice versa. So integer here, so string is 1 and integer is 1, and you can't obviously add a string, so you're going to get unsupported types, and you may see this more often than you'd want, but it does give you some information to look at. So if there's integer, so there's you can't add a integer to a string, but you can add a string to a string, because it just makes 1 1. So that's something to kind of be aware of. And if you need to, you can change strings to integers and back and forth. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that is built in for string manipulation. So we're going to have a string, and let's see, John's a nice guy. And right now it's, I guess, you know, like a sentence would be, so the first letter is capitalized and nothing else is. We're going to call string.lower, and then everything is going to be lowercase. And string.upper, and then everything's uppercase. Title case, the first letter of every word is capitalized. And I use these all the time in Field Calculator. So all these string manipulation tools and math and everything else, you can use them in the Field Calculator if you're working on a table. And then there might be somebody asked, am I going to provide all these scripts? Yes. Everything you've seen today, I'm going to convert the PowerPoint to a PDF, so it's not so big. And then I'm going to send you out all this Python stuff. And then Megan is going to send out the recording. So split is kind of interesting. So split is going to take a string, and by default, again, another nice thing about the IDE is, so if you hold your cursor over, it's going to show you, the text is a little bit small, I can't make that bigger, but it's going to return a list of the words in my string that are separated by a delimiter. So in this case, the delimiter by default, if it's omitted, is white space. So that's going to be a space or a tab. So if you run that, there's a list of items rather than a sentence anymore. And I use this quite a bit. So if I had a zip code, I'm sure nobody else has zip codes that are 5 plus 4. This is a zip. And that's obviously not a number with hyphen in it. And then if I do zip split, and for my character to split it by, I do that. And if at that point, if you just wanted the first one, that's real easy to do. And I do that all the time of data I get to get rid of the last. I just want the first 5 in the zip code. You do the same thing with phone numbers or extensions. There's lots of different ways you can use that. And again, I mentioned case sensitive. So if it's, keys are, because case sensitive is going to cause folks some heartburn. I mean, I know it did me. There is one difference in print. So the print is just how you can print stuff out. So if I was inside of ArcMap and ran print, it would come out in the Python console. If I'm in a program and running it, it would come out to my Python console, and I can see what's printing. And it's great for debugging. You don't want to print more than you need to, because it is interactions between Python and the output, and it can slow things down. And one thing I didn't point out is today I'm using Python 3. So this is the default environment installed by our GS Pro. I've also got a whole bunch of other environments, so I could switch between all these whenever I want to. But today I'm using Python 3 rather than Python 2. So this works, just print and then space, and that works in Python 2. In here, you're going to get an error. So it is best practice when you're working on anything. Now this will work both ways. This will work in Python 2 and Python 3, this print T. And if you're going through something and try to figure out what's wrong, you want to throw a print in, or if you got a failure at some point, you can say, hey, print this variable if it fails. And that way you've got some idea. Like, let's say you're going through a feature class or a table or an Excel sheet, and you get some sort of failure. Well, print the row number or print the feature ID, and that way you can go investigate, just to make sure that you're, just make it easier on you. But nobody wants to sit there and run something in ArcMap and have 600 lines of print come out in the console. It's not really what it's for. That would be more of a logging type thing. And then, like most things, Python has got operators. And I'm jumping around a little bit because some of the stuff, they don't really tie together well, but you need to know what it is as we get into stuff. Because remember, this is geared towards the folks who haven't done any Python or any programming. So we got operators: equal, not equal, greater than, less than, greater than, less than, equal to. And those are comparator operators, and you're going to use those a lot, more than what you think. You use those in SQL statements. You can do those, use them all different kinds of places. And there's all kinds of information on those. Those are the ones that I use most of the time. There is one thing that is a little aggravating with path to data. So the backslash is a special character in Python. And we'll print this out. So here's 4 examples of a path. So that path looks correct, and you would find something. So that double backslash, so the first backslash escapes the second backslash. So when Python sees it, it sees 1 backslash. And then if we go the other way, a /, Python sees that just the same. And the nice thing about this is it doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever. The path is going to be fine. You don't have to worry about it. Python deals with path. The R right here is what I use most of the time. So if you're in, I'll put it where you can see this, maybe. So if you're anywhere, and I run Windows environment, and yes, I need to do cleanup. I've got all kinds of junk. So if you hold the Shift key down and right click, you can do copy as path. And then when you paste that, you're always going to get that. So now that's a valid path in Python. And that's the main reason why I use the R. So it's just Shift, and while you're holding down Shift, right click. The most common thing that's going to happen is if you don't put that R down, it's going to work fine sometimes. But if you put the wrong letter after it, like that little T, that whole thing is a tab. And so now it's going to be C:\tab EMP. And it's going to blow up, and you're not going to know why. And that's very aggravating for a lot of folks getting started. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm going over that. And there's the same thing again. So see, good path, bad path. Paths are also pretty important. If I worked at a company, and every year you would have like 2019, we had a folder, and all of our projects for that year were in that folder. And then the boss would say, "Oh, well, actually, let me take that back." So every year we had a projects folder, and then at the end of the year, so like when 2020 comes around, he would just rename the projects folder to 2019 projects, which breaks every single entire path you have pretty much, unless you're doing relative path, and everything you need is in that folder. So there's some really easy tools and mapping part of that to basically find and replace those path names. And if you get the path wrong and do find and replace, you're going to break a bunch of stuff. So it's very important to understand paths. And let's see. And like I said, that's a special character, but also it's a special character in the sense that I'm going to take variable t here, and then I'm just going to add those together, make 6. But if you have long lines of code, so let's say you had, several hundred characters long, or you're doing something real complex and you want to break it down and still be one line, if you throw a backslash in there, it just continues the line down. So that's exactly the same thing, even though it's on 2 lines. There's this thing called PEP8. Doesn't really matter. I don't use it. But it is the style guide for Python. And it says lines shouldn't be longer than 78 characters long. And that's just for some continuity in code. If you ever get anything from me, they're going to be longer than 78. I mean, almost all the IDEs have word wrap, where it's not a big deal as far as dealing with that. Another thing that I use all the time, and that I feel is important, is so if I try to take my value of T2, which we know is 6 because we just printed it out, and I want to combine that to make a message, I get an error, that nasty error again that says you can't add an integer to a string. What I prefer to do, and I urge you to do it, is to use format. So here's the string I want, and then I do a dot format, and if there's not a whole lot of help for format, but basically anything you stick in there, you put the little curly brackets, and now it's going to insert that value into that spot. And this is still an integer, and this is a string, but it's not going to care. So it does that for you because it knows it's formatted as string. If you're just going to do Python Pro, so your Python 3, there is a newer version called fstring. I'm not going to show it here because it doesn't work in Python 2. And so it's very aggravating whenever you're looking at stuff and it doesn't work. But also with format, you can do some math and manipulation. So I'm going to round 6. I'm going to do 2 decimal places. Obviously, it doesn't have anything, so it's not going to do it. And then I'm also going to square. So here's my brackets. I just changed the way they look. I'm going to square that. And now I've called this to force a format. And there's the link to this. It's a whole language in itself to make stuff format the way you want it. So I'm going to force this to 1 decimal place. So now I have 0.36. So I use this if I'm timing functions and want to let the user know it took 47 seconds because I don't need 17 decimal places. And then you can do, I have 2 curly brackets. So if you don't put anything in them, it says there's the first one, there's the second one, and print. There is another option real quick. So these are indexed, and everything in Python, sorry about that, everything in Python is 0-based index. So this is item 0 and this is item 1. So I got 0 and 1 and 1 and 0. Well, obviously the values are the same, so it's going to say 6, so 6. But if you got long strings, or a lot of times I'll use this if I have SQL statements and I'm changing field name delimiters and I only want to change it in one spot and I have it changed 15 or 20 places in my SQL statement, I can do that. And I mentioned here that Python 3 has F strings, but we're not going to get into that because we can't do it in our map. There's another type of string that's called triple quotes. And so this style of string preserves formatting. And everything in here is passed in just as it is. Python doesn't change it. So even the spacing is preserved, and the indentation is preserved. Same way with the double quotes. And also, I'm calling format, so I can do that. So I've got my triple quotes defined, and then I got my variables. I'm doing math, and I'm adding stuff together, and I'm putting in some other variables from that we used previously. So you can do a lot of stuff with strings and string manipulation, and that's going to be a large part of if you're using geoprocessing tools and Python in general. You're going to be dealing with string manipulation. Clear all this off. So there's the if statement, which helps for logic strings. And everything in Python is going to be indentation level based. So up to this point, everything's been out here on this one level of indentation. And the proper way to indentate is one indentation is 4 spaces. If you use an IDE and not a text editor, it will make sure they're consistent and you don't have tabs or vice versa. Again, use an IDE. So in this case, I'm saying if, well, I'm going to define count. So I just made a variable called count. I'm going to say if my count is in 6 or 7, then proceed. And then I do another if, because you can do as many ifs as you need to. So the way this is going to work is if this one's true, evaluate whatever's in this block. And in this one here, if this one's true, evaluate this block, and then it's going to exit. If this if is not true, I can call a elif, which is short for else if. So it's going to try this one first. If it can't do it, it's going to try this one. And then if it can't do it, it's going to exit. And if there's also the last thing you want to call, and you may or may not need else, if, or else. You can just call if by itself and be done with it if that's what your logic needs. Or you can call else if you're testing for more than one thing. And the way this works is it says if, and since our count is 1, that's not going to be true. It's going to print, it's going to do this. This is the last thing it does. So if this one's not true, this one's going to evaluate or run. And we'll copy that down there. And so it says variables not 6 or 7. And I just did the same thing. So if you don't want to use format string, you can add and change that integer to a string type. But else if is really good for lots of logic and stuff, especially if you're testing for conditions, testing for memberships. Like I want to see, is this value in my list of domains? All different kinds of things. And these are these are super simple examples. This is just so you can get the gist of what's going on. List is probably one of the most used data types that I do. So a list is just a series of objects. In this case, it's just strings. So I got the digits 1 through 5 in string format. I can do mixed types. So I could have strings and numbers and floats and geoprocessing results or booleans. It's just any collection of anything that you want really gathered together. The nice thing about lists is you can change it. You can sort it. You can do a bunch of stuff to it. So that's, and when you get, if you're dealing with data, a lot of times you ask for data, it's going to give you a list. If you go into ArgMap and say, hey, give me the data frames, it's going to give you a list of data frames. And you need to understand lists the way they work. And list is zero-based index. So the first item in this list is the number 1, but it's actually item 0. So if we do LST, the little square brackets means give me the 0 index, which is the first item in the list. Gives me 1. And you will be doing a whole bunch of slicing and dicing on lists. And you can also do, if you, a string is technically a list. So a string is just a list of letters stuck together. So I can also grab the first string. And some of the stuff I use in the field calculator, everything else. Now list, you can change it at any time. You can delete it, you can start over, you can remove items, you can add items, and it's fine. Tuples are very similar to lists. We made a tuple, and it's got mixed types, and it's got a couple numbers, string with single quote, string with double quote, doesn't matter. And I was just reading somebody's chat. Sorry about that. And then, so now tuples, you access the same way. So you got, give me the first item on the list. Give me the third. So 0, 1, 2, 3, because we're zero-based index, gives me the 4th item in the list. But you can't change a tuple. You can't add to it. You can completely destroy it and remake it. That's a noticeable difference. They are faster. So if you're going to make a tuple in one spot and never change it, it is a little bit faster depending on what you're doing. There's another type of data set that can be very handy, and it is called a set. So a set is a unique list of values. So right now I'm passing in 1, 1, 2, 2, 3. And then if I call set, you can see it only kept the uniques. I use this sometimes if I want to get all the unique values for a field. I just take all the values, throw them in a set, and out in the wash comes just unique values. You can add to a set, you can remove to a set, similar type functions of list. One thing to note, though, is sets don't care about order. So you can see I removed 4, well, I added 4, added to the front, and I removed 1, and it's gone, and it kept the order, but it doesn't have to keep the order. So it might be 3, 4, 2 next time you look at it. Order normally doesn't change unless you're touching it, but it's not guaranteed to preserve order. Where list normally keeps order. So if I do list, I get my strings, and I want to add to a list, I just do append, and it sticks it at the end. Append is always going to stick it at the end of the list. And that's important if you're dealing with something that you want to deal with, to make sure that it stays in order if you want the last item in the list. And I don't need these prints since I'm in my interactive debugger, but if you're doing this in the console without print, you won't see anything. Those will just, you'll run all this stuff and it won't tell you what it did. If you need to know how many items are in a list or a tuple or a set, there's a real easy function that's built in called lens, L-E-N, and it gives you 6. So, if you're looking for something, you can say, hey, if my length isn't greater than 4, do this. So that's a perfect example of using an if for something. And then there's slice. So this is the functionality. So you take the list and the start and the end. Remember, it's 0-based. So it includes 0, but it doesn't include the last item. So on that one, I told her to start at 1, which is the second item because we're 0-based index, and stop at the 5th item because we're 0-based index, but only get the 4th because it stops and doesn't include that item. And that takes a little bit to get your head around being 0-based indexed. You can sort list if you wanted to, where you had a whole bunch of items. Apparently I destroyed my list. I did. So some stuff, that was error on my part. So some stuff does it in place. So that doesn't make a new value. It sorts it in place. Some other, if you're dealing with numbers rather than strings, it's kind of nice because I've got a list of numbers, and it says I got integers, integers, integers. If I wanted to say, well, what's the maximum number? There's just called the max function. So it's max and then passing the interval. Well, there's the biggest number in the list. Same thing for minimal. And then there's a sum. So that if you were to add all those together, even include the negative, that's the number you would get. And that's just some built-in functions in pure Python. That's handy to know and nice to have. Another kind of the last thing that I use most of the time is a dictionary. So a dictionary, we'll go over this real quick, is so I'm going to say D is my dictionary, and I use the same brackets I used as set, but in here my first value is going to be a key, and my second one is going to be the value. So that way you can know what's going on. I didn't define key. You can do strings, and so anytime that I want to access the value of key, I get the value. And that works. I use that all the time. A lot of times I may use the key as object ID or the table row number and store the value as the list of all the fields that I want to interact with in there. And then I can call those just based off the object ID or the field record or the primary ID or the global, the GUI ID, the global ID value. I mean, there's lots of stuff that you can use that for. And then to call it, I just said call to, give me that. These are changeable. So I just change that value to set it equal to a new value. Am I running short on time? Megan tells me. Then you can delete. So in this case, you know, if you got a list and you're only going to use it one time, when you use it, you might as well delete it to make it smaller. So I deleted this key value pair using that statement, and then there's my new one. Dictionaries don't have any order, so they don't care, and they may switch orders all the time. There's range. So if you ever need to generate a list of numbers, Python has this built in. There's range, real easy to do. If you just call it the range function, which is built in, part of Python, and say give me the starting number, it defaults to 0. I'll put it in there anyways. I want to stop at 10, and I want to go in steps of 2. And actually in Python 3 it makes a generator, but trust me, if you call that, it just generate 0 to 10 in steps of 2. And we got 3 minutes left, and we're going to touch on loops. So anything that is iterable, so a list, a dictionary, strings, tuples, you can access each item in that list. So in this case, I'm going to use range to make a real short list. And so there's my count of 5. And so for every value in that range, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, because I stop at 5, don't include 5 in my range. So I'll stop at 5, I don't include it. I print out values. We use for loops to access. If you're dealing with cursors, that's the way you access cursors. There's another type of loop that is a while loop. So this is going to evaluate. So this says while my count, which we know is 5 because we set it up here. My count's less than 9. I'm going to run. You want to be careful with while loops to make sure you don't get an infinite loop, because if you didn't have something that was ever going to be false, it would just run forever and your computer would hang. You'd have to crash the program to kill it. In this case, I went through, and now my count is 9, and it printed. The other option you have is you can set a break. So we'll reset our count back to 5. And break works in any sort of loop. So you could put a break up here. So let's say you were looking for a value in a list. You get to that, you can call it break. That way you don't have to keep looking through the rest of the list. In this case, we're going to run that. Now we're going to stop at 7 because the count got to 7 and it broke, even though the code tells it to run here. So I broke it, which stopped the while loop. And looping also is another very important thing to go. So we didn't get quite as far as I wanted to get today, but it is time. I'm going to stay around. I know a lot of this is confusing, but I'm going to send this code out and you can take a look at it. And if anybody's got to go real quick, let me put my my last slide up and then we can answer some questions. So here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out for help. Try to go to the web first, especially if you think it's impossible. Just feel free to give a shout. Also, you know, find some coworkers, find some other folks. Like, I don't think we're going to share the participants with each other, but it would, you know, that this group would be a good group to help each other along the way, probably.
And before we get started on any additional questions, I just wanted to remind everyone that the second webinar in this series on Python will be taking place next week on Wednesday, September 11th at 2 p.m. Central Time. And I will be sending out the dial-in and login information via email probably the day prior. The information will be different than this webinar, so make sure to keep your eyes peeled for that email from me. So if there are any additional questions at this time, please go ahead and type them into the chat box, and Bert will do his best to answer as many as he can.
Is everyone
If there's no,
yeah. Is everyone
if there's no questions, then I guess you did a great job, Bert.
yeah. Well, I imagine is everyone completely lost at this point? Oh, there's one. So system shock. Yeah, you know, it looks like a lot to learn. We're going to start to pull stuff together. And so now that you have some terminology, and I put lots of comment in there, so you can look at that. You know, feel free to reach out, Stack Exchange, Google. There's all different kinds of places. But I'm hoping by the time that we get to the final one in here, you'll be able to write some fairly straightforward scripts to make your life easier. And that's kind of the goal. So somebody asked about system packages and such. So this is not basic level stuff. But so in my IDE, I can install a package. So Python 3 uses Conda. And I can do what I'm not supposed to, and I can update packages in here. So if I want to add a package, I can just run command conda install, and it would do that. But I was going to show you in here. So this is Pro. I got it set to dark mode. You cannot modify the default environment. You can clone one, and then once you clone it, so I didn't show that. So if you click on Manage My Environments, you can clone the default, and then after you have a clone, you can install packages and update packages and add packages. But you can't do any of that to the default environment. I assume because Esri had enough people crashing it after they changed it, they got tired of that. So they still gave you an option to manage that. They did not do that. Also, after you have an environment in here, you can set it. I don't have any cloned. You can set it to be your default environment from the future. So if you have an environment you need that you're going to use all the time, clone this. If you click clone, it does take a while, and then modify it and then set it as your default environment. That's not a real hard thing to do. The other options are, so I have two different versions of ArcGIS 10 Python. So this is the one that installs by default. If you have background processing on, it's going to install the 64-bit version as well. So each one of those are separate environments, and they're real environment, where the Python 3 is a virtual environment. Again, that's way above beyond what the scope of what we're doing here. But if I want to, I can come into like this one, and like Pylant. Pylant is the basically helps you stay with the PEP8 guidelines. So you can just click on that and run and install, and you'll see a bunch of stuff going down through that the window down here as it installs it for you. You can also install straight to the console. The IDE is going to be easier most of the time, and that's, I mean, there's just lots of good reasons for IDEs. Do you want me to give you any code problems to work on after the next session? I don't, and the reason for that is because I want you to work on something that's going to be beneficial to you. Like if I have you work on a problem that I think is relevant for my job, and you're never going to use it, it's not applicable. If you want to go ahead and try to write some code and some loops and do some basic logic, just try to get a feel for how it works, that's perfect. And in a good IDE, which I encourage you to find one and install it, I don't care which one it is. Like at this point, if you want to, you can step through the code. So IDE is going to allow you to set breakpoints. So breakpoint, it will stop when it gets to here. So if I right click, this is the way this IDE works. Your IED might work a little different. I'm using Microsoft Visual Studio Community Edition. Like I said, the main reason why I use it, here, I'll show you that. Visual Studio Community 19 is the latest one. And then you got 3 options. If you go to enterprise, it's like 10 or 15 grand. Community is completely free, and that's what I use. So in this IDE, you set some breakpoints, you right click, you can say start with debugging. It's going to open up another window. So this window wasn't open before. So the longest thing, it takes like 10 or 15 seconds to call that module to load it in. So it did the import, it printed it out. I'm going to move that, move it to my other screen, but you can't see it. And so now, if that would go away, I can step through the code. So if you'll notice over here, I can click and I step through each one, and then it tells me what the values are. And if I'm anywhere inside a bracket, I get some IntelliSense, which we'll go over next time. So it gives me a little bit of information about it. So I just hit continue. It went down to my next breakpoint, which we didn't actually get to. One other thing that I was going to show, and I'll show it again next week, is Esri has some really good IntelliSense. So in my IDE, I hit Control-Shift-Space, and it says, oh, it's looking for in feature class. And then you probably can't see it, but that's bold. So when I jumped the comma, it changed that to bold. And then you can step through what all that is. And also, if you can hold over and look stuff that already evaluated. So input count is 7. Max severity is messages, and there was 2 message counts. There was 1 output. It has a result ID. It's got a status. Yeah, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff ID lets you interrogate that makes your life easier. You can also set up watches. So if you have some variable you're looking for, hey, what's that variable change to? You can watch it as you step through your code. There's another thing that is completely above the scope of this, but when we're talking IDEs, is you can set a conditional breakpoint. So, like if I want to do a condition, and in this case, I'm going to say, oh, T2 is greater than 6, which it will never be, but it would skip this one. You know, there's a little plus on it. But if you're looking for, let's say, an OID or table row 2012 is causing me the issue, well, I can set a conditional breakpoint. I don't have to step through the code. It's just going to run till that equals, 2012. So I can interrogate that much easier. Somebody says try solo learn if you want to be quizzed. I don't know what solo learn is, but okay. Are there any other questions? I mean, I know I would ask if what was unclear, but it's a lot of information. I know there's a lot of stuff that's going to be a little bit unclear, and that's why I put so many comments in there. But now that you understand some of the basic building blocks, as we start getting into the other sessions, you'll know what they are, and if not, you'll have something you can refer back to that will give you some clarification. And reach out to. Learning this stuff for the first time, you're going to want to pull your hair out. But once you get it, sometimes it'll just click, and you'll be like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So, anything else?
Doesn't look like it. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, and I would like to thank you, Bert, for volunteering to share your time and expertise with us today. And we will talk to you all next week on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.
Yep. Bye.